Before you step into this story, take a deep breath. What you are about to hear is not just a tale, it is a wound carved into a mother's life, a betrayal that turned love into exile. If this story moves you, don't let it vanish in silence. Subscribe, share it so others can feel its weight, and leave your voice in the comments. Your words matter, and sometimes, they are the only light left for someone lost in the dark. The suitcase burst open on the curb, and my clothes spilled across the wet pavement as if my life had been ripped from a drawer and thrown into the street for strangers to step over. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving a thin sheen of water that clung to the fabric of my blouses, the ones I ironed carefully on Sunday nights after working all week. I stared at the pile of clothes, at the pale blue blouse my mother once said made my eyes look softer, at the pair of black shoes I wore to my daughter's graduation in 2017, and it felt like every sacrifice I had made was dissolving into the sidewalk. Behind me, the taxi meter ticked impatiently, and above me, the window I had paid rent for 18 years slid open. My daughter leaned out, her face lit by the yellow glow of the room I once called home, and with a voice stripped of hesitation, she said, "Here inside there is only space for his family. You are just a burden." Then she closed the window with a firm click, as if sealing me out, not just from the house, but from the life I had built inside it. I had been gone for 6 days. Just 6 days. I left on a Thursday morning at 7:30, suitcase rolling unevenly because of a broken wheel, to take care of my sister who was recovering from a small surgery. I sent my daughter a message at 07:32 saying I'd be back on Sunday. She replied with a heart. On Friday she wrote, "Everything's fine here, don't worry." But on Saturday, while I was still sitting in a hospital cafeteria 400 kilometers away, she and her husband began moving my things to the sidewalk, stuffing decades of my sacrifices into garbage bags. By the time I returned late Sunday evening, nothing of mine remained inside except the key in my pocket, a key that no longer fit the lock. They had changed it. The house I built, the rent I paid, the walls I painted, had closed its doors on me forever. I stood on the front step at 19:05 and rang the bell. At 19:19, I rang again. At 19:43, I left a voice message that I deleted because my voice cracked with the desperation of a beggar. At 20:12, the upstairs light went out. When the door finally creaked open, my son-in-law appeared only far enough to block the entrance with his shoulder. "We decided this is better for everyone," he said in a flat tone, as if I were some household item they no longer needed. I wanted to scream, "Everyone? Does everyone include me? Does everyone include the woman who worked double shifts at the bakery for 12 years, who woke up at 4 in the morning to knead dough that paid for your wedding suit?" But the words jammed in my throat. He closed the door, leaving me outside with nothing but my wet clothes and the echo of his sentence ringing in my ears. I thought about the beginning, about 2008, when we first rented this house for 700 rays a month. I remember counting the money twice before placing it in the landlord's hand, the pride swelling in my chest as I signed the contract with my daughter by my side. We painted the living room ourselves with discounted white paint, and she left her fingerprints on the wall near the window, giggling, saying she wanted to leave her mark. I never painted over them. I bought her braces when she was 15, 230 rays a month for a year and a half, and a used computer in 2014 for 900 rays so she could finish her assignments. When she wanted to change majors in college, I sold the small gold chain my mother had given me just to cover the deposit. I remember her hugging me in the kitchen, saying, "One day I'll take care of you." I believed her as if it were gospel truth. And yet here I was, standing in the rain with nothing but a broken suitcase. I sat down on the step, my shoulder bruised from lifting the bag. I could hear the refrigerator humming inside, the same one I had bought secondhand in 2010. I imagined my bed, the one I purchased in 2016 for 1,150 reais, paid in 10 installments. I had chosen it because it was sturdy and simple, the kind of bed that felt like safety. And now, I had learned through whispers from a neighbor that bed had been given to his mother, my son-in-law's mother, who moved in, just for a while, after the wedding, but quietly made herself permanent. I remembered the first time she called me dear, the way she smiled as she corrected how I hung the towels, as she rearranged the kitchen shelves, as she claimed authority over spaces I had worked decades to create. She paid for nothing, but her decisions filled the house. Curtains closed, shoes at the door, meals cooked her way. My daughter began to repeat her words as if they were her own. It started small, but slowly my place in my own home shrank until only the bed remained. And now even that was gone. By 22 I carried my things to the bus stop, coins in my pocket amounting to 50 res. Not enough for a hotel, barely enough for bread and transport. I called my sister. She told me not to cry where they could see. I said it was only the wind making my eyes water. That was the lie our family women always told. I'm fine, I'm strong, I can handle it. I told it when I worked overtime, when I skipped meals, when I covered debts that weren't mine. And tonight, I told it again while the people I raised slept in my house. At 23:00, I asked the church guard if I could stay in the pews until morning. He handed me a bottle of water, and I laid my head on my sweater under the silent crucifix, the smell of candles and wilted flowers pressing against my chest. I thought of every receipt in the shoebox under my bed, every coin I stretched, every prayer I whispered, and I realized all of it. The sacrifices, the nights without rest, the promises, had been thrown onto the pavement with my clothes. My daughter's words had cut me from the family like a branch sawed off a tree. In that silence, staring at the cracked ceiling of the church, I understood I was no longer part of her definition of home. When dawn crept in through the stained glass at 4:52, I stood and smoothed my blouse. The key in my pocket was useless now, but I clenched it anyway, as if holding on to proof that I had once belonged. Outside, the buses rumbled awake, and the city began again, unaware that my world had ended. I looked once more at the window of the house I had built, and when the curtain didn't move, I knew this was the morning I would begin again. Not because I wanted to, but because they had erased me. The morning air was sharp against my face as I stepped out of the church gates, the weight of my suitcase dragging behind me like a wounded limb. It was 5:15, and the city was waking. Vendors arranging crates of fruit that smelled of wet soil. Buses coughing black smoke as they lined up at the depot. Women in uniforms hurrying toward jobs that would not pay them enough to buy the shoes they wore thin. I moved among them with no direction, clutching the useless key in my pocket, feeling like a ghost drifting through a place that once belonged to me. The houses looked the same, the corner bakery already warm with the scent of bread. But I was outside the circle now, pushed beyond the invisible line that separates those who belong from those who are discarded. I thought of all the years I lived within that house, each one layered with sacrifices I never stopped making. 2009 was the year I took a second shift at the bakery, cleaning floors and ovens until my knees ached, just to cover my daughter's school trip. The bus to Salvador, the hotel fee, the packed lunch. She came back with photographs of herself by the sea, smiling with her friends, and when she showed me, I told her she looked radiant. I didn't tell her I spent those 3 days sleeping 4 hours a night between shifts. In 2011, the bakery cut hours, and I scrubbed stairwells for a construction company for 70 reais a day. I remember the way the bleach burned the inside of my nose, the way I pressed coins into my daughter's palm anyway so she could buy new notebooks for the semester. In 2014, she asked for a computer because her friends had one. 900 reais was a mountain, but I climbed it. I worked every Sunday that year, and when I handed her the box, she hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would snap. She said, "One day, all of this will be worth it." I held on to that promise as if it were oxygen, but promises dissolve quickly in the mouth of those who never meant them. I realized that as I sat on the bus stop bench watching couples walk hand in hand, their conversations spilling into the air like careless songs. I pulled the receipts from my bag, the ones I carried out of habit, little slips of paper proving the value of my existence. Electricity bills stamped paid, the ink smudged with years. Grocery receipts listing rice, beans, cooking oil, soap. Rent stubs folded and unfolded so many times they had become soft. I held them like relics, evidence that I had once mattered, that I had once been the center of a life. And yet, to my daughter, I was no more than a burden. The word echoed in my skull, louder than the buses, louder than the pigeons scattering at the square. Burden. As if I hadn't carried every burden for her since the day she was born. By 7:30, I found myself standing in front of the clinic, where I sometimes filled in as a cleaner. The tiles were cold under my shoes, and the receptionist blinked when she saw me. "You weren't scheduled," she said. I smiled, small and thin. "I know, but if anyone is out today, I can stay." She shook her head. "We're full." I nodded, thanked her, and walked away with the humiliation burning in my chest. I counted my money again, 47 Rs and 20 cents. Enough for bread, and maybe 2 nights in a shared room if I begged the boarding house owner to give me credit. I walked to the market, hoping for a few hours bagging groceries. The manager looked at me the way people look at stray dogs. "Not today," he said. I thanked him anyway. That's what women like me do. We thank even when dismissed. At noon, I sat in the park eating a small roll and half an apple. I watched mothers push strollers, young girls scrolling on their phones, old men feeding pigeons. None of them knew that a woman in her 50s sat among them with nowhere to go. My body was there, but my mind kept circling back to the house. Was she sitting at the kitchen table now, laughing with him and his mother? Was she already using my bed, stretching out under the blanket I bought in winter 2019? I pictured them moving my photo frames to a box, throwing away the shoebox of receipts, erasing my fingerprints from the walls. Each image stabbed deeper until I felt hollow. How do you lose everything in 6 days? How does a daughter turn her back on the woman who gave her everything? I searched for answers in the faces of strangers walking by, but they offered none. Only the silence of a city too busy to care. By evening, exhaustion pushed me toward the boarding house. The owner, a woman with hair dyed a shade of red too bright for her age, looked me over with a calculating eye. 70 a night, she said. I laid 50 on the counter, my hands trembling. I'll pay the rest in 2 days, I swear. She stared at me, weighing whether I was worth the gamble. Finally, she slid the key across the counter. The room smelled of damp wood and loneliness. A thin mattress sagged against a rusted frame. I laid my clothes carefully on the chair, folded the blouse that still smelled faintly of lavender detergent, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands shook as I held the useless key from my old house, the metal cold against my palm. I wanted to throw it out the window, but instead I clutched it tighter. It was proof that once I had belonged somewhere, proof that once my sacrifices had a home. That night, I dreamed of my daughter as a little girl, her hair tangled from sleep, her small hands reaching for me in the dark. She whispered, "Don't go, Mama." I woke with tears wetting the pillow, the sound of her adult voice still echoing in my mind. "You are just a burden." I lay there staring at the ceiling, the paint peeling in thin strips, and wondered how love could rot so completely. I thought of the years I had believed we were bound by something unbreakable, and now I realized those bonds had been made of paper. The kind of paper you fold into promises, into receipts, into contracts that mean nothing once torn. And as the dawn seeped through the cracked window of that room, I understood that I had crossed into a different life, one where the family I built had chosen to erase me, and I had to learn how to exist outside their walls. The second morning in the boarding house began with the sound of doors slamming in the hallway, and a baby crying in the room next to mine. The thin mattress had left grooves in my back, and my body ached from the weight of carrying not only the suitcase, but also the shame of being exiled from the house I had built with my own hands. I rose slowly, folded my sweater, and looked at the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My hair had grayed more than I realized. My eyes were ringed with exhaustion, and my mouth was set in a line of defeat. Yet beneath that reflection, I could still see the woman who had once carried trays of bread heavier than her own body, who had walked home in the rain to save the bus fare, who had built a life out of nothing but persistence. That woman was not gone. She was buried under betrayal, but she was still breathing. I walked to the bakery on the corner, the same one where I used to stop for flour when I baked at home. The smell of fresh bread hit me like a memory I couldn't swallow. I bought a small roll with the last of my coins and ate it slowly, tearing pieces with my fingers. Around me, Life went on as if nothing had happened. People hurried to work. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves. Delivery men shouted across the street. None of them knew that just 2 blocks away, a daughter had locked her mother out and declared her a burden. None of them knew that the bed I had paid in installments now cradled another woman, that the kitchen I scrubbed for years now served meals without me. I wanted to stop strangers and tell them, to scream my story into their ears, but I stayed silent, swallowing each bite of bread as if silence were my only dignity left. Later that day, I returned to the market, hoping the manager might have changed his mind. He didn't. His eyes skimmed over me as if I were invisible. I thought of all the years I had worked quietly, never late, never absent, never complaining. Yet now, when I needed a chance, the world turned its back with the same coldness my daughter had shown. I wandered through the aisles pretending to shop just so I could be inside somewhere warm. I touched bags of beans, cartons of milk, and imagined filling a cart as I used to when I cooked for my daughter. I remembered her favorites: beans cooked with garlic, rice with lemon, chicken roasted on Sundays. She used to say no one made food like me. She used to smile at the table, her face glowing in the soft light of our home. I wondered when that smile stopped being mine. By evening, I found myself walking past the house again. I told myself I only wanted to pass by, to see if the lights were on, to feel close to what I had lost. But when I saw the curtains drawn tight and the faint glow of the television flickering inside, my chest tightened. I could almost hear their laughter, muffled by the walls I had once painted. I stood there for several minutes, clutching the useless key in my pocket, until a neighbor spotted me and gave a pitying smile. I turned quickly and walked away, ashamed to be seen as the woman left outside her own home. The shame burned deeper than hunger. That night, back at the boarding house, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the baby's cries, the shuffle of feet in the hallway, the distant hum of the city. My thoughts spiraled back through the years like a reel of film. I saw myself in 2012, carrying trays of bread at 4 a.m, my fingers raw from kneading dough. I saw myself in 2015, scrubbing hospital floors to pay for my daughter's courses, swallowing the bitterness of being invisible as doctors and nurses stepped around me. I saw myself in 2017, clapping as she received her diploma, tears blurring my vision, pride swelling in my chest. And I saw myself in 2020 during the pandemic, working cleaning shifts with gloves too thin to protect me, risking illness so she wouldn't go hungry. Each image was stitched with sacrifice, and each sacrifice now felt like a thread pulled loose, unraveling the fabric of my life. But as I turned these memories over, something new surfaced. A detail I had ignored before, a whisper of suspicion. The week before I left for my sister's surgery, I had overheard a conversation between my daughter and her husband in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the words drifted through the crack in the door. "It will be easier when she's not here," he said. My daughter answered softly, "Just a little longer." At the time, I thought they meant something about the rent, or about his mother who had already overstayed her welcome. But now, lying in that sagging bed, I realized those words had been about me. They had been planning this. My absence was not an inconvenience they endured. It was the opportunity they waited for. I remembered how his mother had looked at me the morning I left, her eyes sharp, her smile too smooth. She had wished me a safe trip, but there was something triumphant in her tone, as if she knew that when I returned, the house would no longer be mine. The more I replayed it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a plan. My daughter, my own blood, had chosen to conspire against me, to erase me so her husband's mother could take my place. The betrayal wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The weight of that realization pressed down harder than the thin mattress beneath me. My body shook with anger, with grief, with the kind of pain that claws at your ribs until you can hardly breathe. I whispered to myself in the dark, "How could she? How could she choose them over me?" The room gave no answer, only the steady drip of water from a leaking pipe somewhere in the building. My tears fell into the pillow, soaking the cheap fabric, and I clutched the useless key until my hand cramped. I knew then that this was not just about being locked out, it was about being replaced. My daughter hadn't simply closed the door, she had handed my life to someone else. When dawn came again, gray and heavy, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the window. I realized I was standing at the edge of a truth I didn't want to face. This wasn't just a betrayal born of weakness. It was a betrayal born of choice. And the choice was mine to understand or to deny. As I tied my worn shoes and prepared to face another day, I knew I had to uncover the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. Because only then would I know whether I had lost my daughter forever, or whether she had never truly been mine. On the third day away from my own home, I stopped counting the hours and began counting the ways in which silence can suffocate a person. Silence in the hallway of the boarding house where footsteps passed without acknowledgement. Silence on the phone when I tried calling my daughter and the line went unanswered. Silence in my chest where pride had once lived, replaced now by a hollow ache that pulsed every time I remembered her voice saying I was a burden. Yet, worse than silence was the memory of the requests that had prepared me for this fall. The requests I had ignored because a mother always convinces herself that sacrifice is love and not manipulation. I thought back to the winter of 2021, when my daughter first asked me to transfer the utility bills into her name. "It will be easier for us," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. I agreed because I wanted to make her life simpler, because I trusted her. I didn't realize that in that moment, piece by piece, the foundation of my security was being dismantled. The bills, the contracts, the small proofs that tied me to the house slowly disappeared from my name. When I asked her about it months later, she smiled and said, "Mama, don't worry. This is just paperwork." Paperwork, she called it. But paperwork was how lives were erased without anyone noticing until it was too late. Then came the summer of 2022, when her husband lost his job for the third time. She came to me in the kitchen, her voice soft, her eyes wide. "Could you cover the rent for a while? Just 2 months until he gets back on his feet." I didn't hesitate. I worked extra cleaning shifts at the hospital, scrubbing toilets until my skin cracked, just to make sure they didn't feel the weight of those payments. 2 months stretched into 6, and when he finally found work again, nothing returned to me. When I asked gently if they could repay even part of what I had given, she sighed, annoyed, as if my request was unreasonable. "You've always been the strong one," she said. "You can handle it." That sentence became her shield, her excuse to take more and more from me. I believed it because I wanted to believe that being strong meant being loved. But the most impossible request came last spring, when she asked me to give up my bedroom. "Mama, you don't need such a big space. You're alone. Let us take it, and you can have the smaller room in the back." I hesitated then, the protest rising in my throat, but her eyes filled with tears, and I swallowed my own needs once more. I moved my bed, my shoebox of receipts, my small treasures into that smaller room, convincing myself it was temporary. But deep down, I knew what it was: a surrender. I had handed over my claim to the house, shrinking my existence to a corner, a whisper, a presence that could be pushed aside when convenient. And that was exactly what happened. The manipulation was not only financial, it was emotional. She began to speak to me with the same tone her husband's mother used, a tone wrapped in politeness but laced with contempt. "Maybe you shouldn't cook so much, Mama. You waste ingredients. Maybe you should stay in your room when we have guests, Mama. They don't feel comfortable. Maybe you should rest more, Mama. You're getting older." Each suggestion was a brick laid between us, a wall rising higher until I could no longer see the daughter I once knew. I thought she was being influenced, that her husband and his mother whispered poison into her ears. But perhaps the truth was that she found it easier to stand on their side than to stand with me. Perhaps she wanted the weight of me off her shoulders, just as she claimed I had been the weight on hers. Sitting in the boarding house, I realized how often she had trained me to accept less, to silence myself, to disappear. She had asked for small sacrifices until there was nothing left to give. The first time she refused to let me decide what furniture to buy, I told myself it didn't matter. The first time she asked me to stop correcting her husband about bills, I told myself it wasn't my place. The first time she ignored my stories from work, scrolling on her phone while I spoke, I told myself she was tired. Each time I excused her, I let her carve pieces out of me. And now the carving was complete. There was nothing left except the outline of a woman erased from her own family. I thought of confronting them, of banging on the door until they had no choice but to face me. But what would I say? That I wanted my bed back? That I wanted my place at the table restored? No amount of shouting would bring back the promises, the love, the years. The truth was harder. I had to accept that my daughter had made a choice. She chose them over me, and if I demanded entry, I would not find the daughter I once knew, only a stranger wearing her face. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. That night, lying awake on the sagging mattress, I remembered a phrase my mother once said when I was a child. Be careful who you sacrifice for, because some will build their throne on your broken back. At the time, I thought it was bitterness speaking, the residue of her own disappointments. But now I understood it was prophecy. My daughter had built her comfort on my sacrifices, and once the throne was tall enough, she no longer needed the foundation that held it up. She kicked it away. She kicked me away. As I closed my eyes, I wondered if I could ever forgive her. If forgiveness was even possible when betrayal is not a single moment, but a series of years disguised as love. I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that the silence around me was thicker than any noise, and in that silence, I heard the truth. I had lost more than a house. I had lost the illusion that love was unbreakable. The fourth night in the boarding house was colder than the others, the thin blanket no match for the damp that crept through the cracked window. I curled myself into a ball, my suitcase pressed against the bed frame, as if the few belongings inside could keep me anchored to something that was still mine. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by the memory of my daughter's voice slicing through the air like a knife. You are just a burden. I had heard those words every night since, looping in my head, replaying with different tones, sometimes sharp with anger, sometimes cold with indifference, sometimes heavy with finality. Each repetition stripped me further of the illusion that I was still her mother in any meaningful sense. I was a tenant who had overstayed, an obstacle to be cleared away, a shadow unwelcome in the light of her new life. By morning, my body was stiff, but my mind refused rest. I decided I could not continue drifting aimlessly. I needed answers. Something solid to explain how a child raised with so much sacrifice could turn her heart so completely against the hand that fed her. So I walked back to the neighborhood, each step dragging me closer to the house that no longer recognized me. I told myself I would not knock, I would not beg, I would only observe. But deep down, I knew I was still clinging to a thread of hope, fragile and foolish, that perhaps this was all a mistake, that perhaps she would see me standing there and open the door. When I turned the corner and saw the house, I stopped short. The curtains were open for the first time in days. Through the window, I could see the silhouette of his mother arranging flowers on the table I had polished for years. My table. A table bought in installments from a shop on Avenida Santos, chosen carefully because its wood was sturdy enough to last decades. She stood there as if she owned it, her hands smoothing the cloth, her shoulders relaxed in a comfort that cut me like glass. Then I saw my daughter enter the room, carrying plates, laughing at something the woman said. The sight was worse than any insult. It was confirmation that she wasn't being coerced. She wasn't being manipulated against her will. She was participating, choosing, belonging fully to this new circle that excluded me. I stayed hidden behind the tree across the street, watching the life that used to be mine unfold without me. At one point, her husband walked in carrying groceries. I could see the labels even from where I stood, brands I used to stretch into meals that lasted all week. They set them on the counter, and for a moment, I could almost hear my daughter's voice saying, "Mama, don't forget to soak the beans tonight." But instead, she laughed with them, her back turned to the window, her face lit by a joy that had no space for me. Something inside me shifted then. The pain burned hotter, sharper, until it turned into anger, not just at her, but at myself. Anger for ignoring the warning signs, for excusing the changes, for convincing myself that love was enough to cover the cracks. I remembered the phone call last year when she asked me to sign papers for the house, saying it was for insurance purposes. I didn't question her, I trusted her. I signed where she told me, not realizing I was signing away the last legal ties I had to the place. My name had been erased quietly, with my own hand helping. And now, as I stood in the shadows, I understood. They had been planning this long before I packed my suitcase for that trip. The betrayal was not spontaneous. It was calculated. Each step had been orchestrated. The transfer of bills, the requests for money, the bedroom surrendered, the signatures collected. I wasn't just abandoned. I was methodically removed, erased with precision until my presence was nothing more than a memory. They hadn't waited for me to leave. They had made sure that when I returned, there was nothing left for me to claim. I pressed my back against the tree and tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy, as if the whole world had conspired to choke me. My knees trembled, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the pavement. But I forced myself to stand, to walk away before anyone saw me. The shame of being witnessed in my exile was worse than the exile itself. I carried my anger back to the boarding house, my steps quick, my hands clenched around the useless key still in my pocket. That night, I laid on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, piecing together the puzzle I had refused to see before. It was not just about a bed, or a room, or even a house. It was about identity. For decades, I had defined myself as a mother, the one who provided, who endured, who sacrificed. And now, in the cruelest twist, the very child I had built my life around had stripped me of that role, casting me out like trash. Who was I now, if not her mother? Who was I, if not the woman who worked and saved and gave everything for her? As I lay there, the boarding house echoing with the noise of strangers, I realized the lie was not only theirs. It had been mine too. The lie that love was unconditional. The lie that sacrifice guaranteed loyalty. The lie that if I gave everything, I would always belong. These lies had carried me through years of exhaustion, through nights of hunger, through days of humiliation, and now they crumbled around me, leaving me with nothing but the truth. Love can be bought, sacrifice can be forgotten, and family can become strangers. The anger gave me strength, but it was a dangerous kind, sharp and unsteady. I gripped it tightly anyway, because without it I would collapse into despair. I told myself I would no longer beg, no longer knock on doors that had been closed to me, but I also knew I could not continue drifting forever. If they had erased me, I would find a way to write myself back into existence. Not for them, but for me. As dawn approached, I made a decision. I would not hide in the shadows anymore. I would uncover the full extent of what they had done. I would find the papers I had signed. I would ask the questions I had been too afraid to ask. And I would face the truth, no matter how cruel it was. Because only in facing it could I begin to rebuild from the ruins they had left me in. The next morning I walked with purpose for the first time since everything collapsed. The anger that had burned in me during the night turned into a kind of cold determination. I could no longer accept the story as it had been told to me, that I was simply a burden, that I was disposable. I needed proof, something tangible that explained how my life had been stripped away so efficiently. I started with the city office, a squat gray building where I had once stood in line to pay property taxes, where clerks with tired eyes and stacks of papers decided the borders of people's lives. My palms sweated as I handed over my identification and asked about the house. The clerk tapped on her keyboard, the rhythm of the keys echoing in my chest like a countdown. She looked at the screen, then back at me, her expression neutral in that practiced bureaucratic way. "This property is registered under 2 names," she said. "Your daughter and her husband." I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. I wanted to scream, to pound the desk and demand she look again. But I stayed still, the way poor people learn to stay still in offices because anger never wins against paperwork. "And before?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Before it was in my name, correct?" She clicked again. "There was a transfer last year. The documents are signed." I asked if I could see them, and after a long pause, she slid copies across the counter. My hands shook as I unfolded the papers. There was my signature, unmistakable, curling at the end the way it always had. I remembered the day she had put them in front of me, saying it was for insurance, for security. I had signed without reading every line, trusting her, trusting my own daughter. And here it was, the proof of my erasure, written in ink by my own hand. I walked out of the office clutching the papers, my vision blurred by tears. The city street tilted under my feet, cars honking, vendors shouting, life pressing forward as if nothing monumental had just shattered. I sat on a bench and stared at the signatures, my name tangled with theirs, and realized how easily love can be weaponized. It wasn't a single betrayal. It was a conspiracy, a plan woven quietly through months, maybe years, each thread disguised as care, as necessity, as help. They hadn't taken advantage of my absence by chance. They had created the absence they needed. Memories flooded me like a cruel film reel. Her husband insisting I shouldn't worry about bills anymore, that they would handle the paperwork. My daughter smiling as she asked for my identification, telling me it was just a formality. The mother-in-law standing in the kitchen the morning I left, her voice smooth as she wished me a good trip. They had all known. I was the only one still believing I belonged. The humiliation seared through me, not only because they had taken my home, but because they had made me an accomplice in my own eviction. My trust had been the tool they used to destroy me. That night in the boarding house, I spread the papers across the thin blanket, tracing the lines with my finger, searching for some loophole, some mistake that could undo the truth. There was none. My name was not an owner anymore. My daughter had cut me out with precision, leaving me only the useless key in my pocket, a relic of a lock that no longer recognized me. The baby in the next room cried again, and I wondered if his mother ever feared that one day he might do to her what mine had done to me. Did any mother imagine such betrayal when she kissed her child's forehead at night? Or was betrayal always invisible until it was too late? I tried to remember the last time my daughter had said she loved me. Not out of habit, not the casual "love you" tossed before leaving the house, but real words, full and deliberate. I couldn't recall. The silence of that absence struck me harder than the papers. Love had vanished long before the door closed. These documents were only the final act in a play that had been rehearsed quietly, invisibly, for years. I knew I couldn't live in the boarding house forever. My money was dwindling, each day shrinking the little I had left. I thought of confronting her with the papers, slamming them down on the table and demanding an explanation. But I already knew the answer. She would say it was for the best. She would say she had no choice. She would say I was difficult, that I made things hard, that she deserved peace. The words were already written in her mouth, rehearsed by her new family, and nothing I could say would bring back what had been taken. So instead, I began to think differently. Maybe I didn't need to fight for the house. Maybe I needed to fight for myself. The thought terrified me, because for decades my identity had been built entirely around her, around being a mother, a provider, a shield. Who was I without her? Without the house? Without the receipts? Without the sacrifices pinned to her like medals she never acknowledged? I stared at the papers again and realized they were not just proof of betrayal. They were also freedom, though a brutal kind. Freedom from the illusion that love had bound us. Freedom from the endless demands disguised as affection. It was a freedom I hadn't asked for, but one I would have to learn to carry. That night, I folded the papers carefully, slid them into the lining of my suitcase, and lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling. I whispered to myself that I was still alive, that I still had worth, even if my daughter had decided otherwise. The words felt hollow, but I repeated them until sleep came in fragments. And when morning arrived, pale light seeping through the broken curtain, I stood with the papers heavy in my bag and a thought heavier still in my heart. Perhaps losing everything was the only way to finally see the truth. The day after I folded the papers into the lining of my suitcase, I woke with a steadier pulse, as if some part of me had decided to stop drowning and stand up in the water. I washed my face in the rusty sink and told my reflection that I would not let a signature be the final word on my life. The hallway smelled of boiled coffee and floor disinfectant. A radio muttered the morning news behind a door. I put on my cleanest blouse, the pale blue one my mother once liked, and walked out into a light so white it made the street look scrubbed. I had 41 rays left and the kind of resolve that sometimes visits the poor like a startled bird, fragile and bright. I decided I would go back to the office, not to beg, but to ask for a certified copy of everything. If they had used paper to erase me, I would use paper to reveal them. At the counter, a different clerk took my request. She was older, with a careful way of reading lines as if each word could bite. She printed a stack and stamped it in purple ink. The thump of the stamp felt satisfying, like a drumbeat I could march to. I stepped aside to a metal bench and unfolded the sheets one by one. This time I read slowly, lips moving in a whisper as if I were learning a new language. Transfer of ownership, names listed, dates I recognized, my signature curving at the bottom. I felt the same sting of humiliation begin, but then the older clerk approached and tapped a finger on the lower corner of a page I had already skimmed. "Here," she said softly. "Read this line again." My eyes returned to a sentence I had ignored the day before, a sentence that had seemed like the footnote of a life. Reservation of habitation in favor of the previous occupant, back bedroom, for the duration of her life. The air shifted. I did not breathe for 3 heartbeats. I stared until the words stopped looking like shapes and turned into meaning. A clause, clear and simple, written in the same careful language that had removed me, now saying that I had the right to live there. The old clerk watched my face and added, "People forget that rights hide in the small print. They count on you not reading." I swallowed so hard it hurt. I asked for another stamped copy and put both into a plastic sleeve as if they were a newborn I needed to keep dry. Outside, the street noise crashed back into me, but now it felt like oxygen. I sat on the curb and let the sun warm my scalp. There it was, in ink. They had not just betrayed me. They had lied to me about what the papers meant, and they had lied to themselves about what they could erase. The clause did not give me back my daughter. It did not repair the cracked mirror, but it gave me a foothold, a nail in the wall I could grip to keep from sliding into the dark. My back bedroom, the one that smelled of detergent at 4 in the afternoon, the one where I folded laundry while the city hummed. The law said I belonged in that room until I drew my last breath. I repeated the phrase like a rosary, until my mouth tasted of iron. On the walk back, I passed the bakery and bought 1 roll and a small coffee. I drank it standing, watching a little boy lick sugar off his fingers while his mother laughed. For a flicker of a moment, I saw my daughter at 6, her hair tangled, her eyes bright, the child who used to climb into my lap and ask if she could help stir the cake batter. The memory jolted me like a misstep in the dark. How does a face move from that to the window closing? I placed the cup in the bin and squared my shoulders. The question had no answer that would help me survive the morning, so I let it pass like a bus I could not catch. I went to the small clinic where I sometimes cleaned and asked the head nurse if there were any temporary shifts. She glanced at the clock and nodded. 2 hours in the afternoon, exam rooms and the restroom. It pays little, she said, but it is honest work. I thanked her. And for those 2 hours the world narrowed to surfaces and shine. I wiped and mopped and changed bins. I thought, with each pass of the cloth, that if I could make these rooms clean, maybe I could make my life clean too, cutting away the greasy film of lies until the original color showed. When I left, they put 40 rayés in my hand. Paper again. Lighter than it should be, but warmer than the air. Before returning to the boarding house, I decided to walk by the street of my old home. It was late afternoon, that hour when shadows stretch thin. I told myself I only wanted to pass, to see the tree and the chipped step and the mailbox that stuck in wet weather. As I turned the corner, a voice called my name. Donna Ivoni, who lived 3 doors down, hurried toward me with her handbag clutched like a book. She looked around as if gossip were a wind that could carry her away. "I have been waiting to see you," she said, and her eyes softened in a way that made my throat burn. She told me she had heard them saying I had chosen to live with my sister, that I had left of my own will. She had watched the day they took my bed down the stairs. She had asked my daughter if I knew, and my daughter had looked past her as if the question were a mosquito in summer. Then Yvonne leaned closer and whispered something that made the sunlight tilt. "He has a cousin in Sorocaba," she said. "They talked about selling before Christmas and moving there. They want money in hand. They say you will not be a problem because you are soft." I stood very still. Sorocaba felt like another planet, a name from a weather report. The plan slid into place like a drawer. Of course, they needed me gone to sell easily. An old woman with a right to a back room made a sale difficult. They did not want difficult. They wanted clean money and a clean story. I thanked Yvonne and she squeezed my arm. I walked away with my jaw tight. The rain smell lifted off the pavement and the sky pressed low. I took the long way to the boarding house, thinking in steps. The clause means I can return. But a piece of paper is a small shield against a closed door and a hard shoulder. I would need someone who spoke for me in rooms where voices get tall. A public defender, perhaps. Or the quiet lawyer 2 streets from the market who always wore the same navy suit. I did not like the thought of sitting in offices where I would have to tell the story again, where I would watch pity pull at the corners of strangers' mouths. But if pity opened the right door, I would carry it like a bucket. That evening, I laid the stamped copies on the bed and smoothed them flat with my palm. The baby next door laughed for the first time since I moved in, a small bubbling sound that made my eyes sting. I wrote on a scrap of paper the steps for tomorrow. Go to the legal aid office at 8, bring identification, bring the stamped clause, ask what I can do, ask how to protect the room, ask how to stop a sale, ask if I can go back with a witness. I wrote the verbs large. Ask, ask, ask. I had spent years never asking, assuming my place was to give and to accept. I would not do that anymore. Sleep did not come quickly. My mind replayed every scene from the past year and fitted them into new shapes now that I knew the shape of the clause. The day she asked for my identification. The moment his mother put her things in my closet. The week the lock was changed. The lie they told the neighbor. The laughter through the curtain. Beneath the pain, a different feeling flickered. Not joy, not relief, but a hard brightness that clicked into the sockets behind my eyes. I was not powerless. They had counted on my ignorance. They had counted on my love, wrapping the lie so softly that I would not feel its edge. Tomorrow, I would bring the edge to them. At dawn, I stood by the window and listened to the first bus rattle by. The light was colorless, the kind that makes everything look like a photograph from an old album. I dressed, slid the papers into my bag, and held the useless key for a moment between my fingers. I thought of the back room, of the shelf where I lined up jars, of the thin curtain that moved in the afternoon wind, of the smell of soap, of the way the sun got caught on the metal frame of the bed at 5:30. I thought of sitting there again, not as a beggar on a mat, but as a woman in her rightful place, even if the house around me had become foreign ground. I could not bring back the tenderness that had lived inside those walls, but I could reclaim the square of floor my life had clung to. It would not heal everything. It might heal a sliver. I opened the door to the corridor and stepped into the day with my spine a little taller than yesterday, a sentence in my bag that said the quiet truth out loud. The legal aid office opened its doors at exactly 8, but I had been standing outside since 7, papers clutched in my bag, the morning air chilling my fingers even through the fabric of my sweater. I wasn't alone. People had begun to line up long before me. An old man with his hat pulled low, a mother rocking a baby who whimpered softly, a teenager with hollow cheeks who smelled of cigarette smoke. All of us waiting for someone to notice our lives had tipped into disaster. When the guard finally unlocked the doors, we shuffled in like cattle, each clutching our folders and envelopes as if they contained the proof that we deserved to exist. I took a numbered ticket, 47, and sat on a plastic chair whose legs wobbled against the tiled floor. The waiting room smelled of dust and cheap disinfectant, and on the far wall, a fan clicked endlessly as it tried to stir the heavy air. The minutes dragged. Each number called another reminder of how many stories of ruin had been stacked before mine. I studied the faces around me. A man in overalls rubbed grease-stained hands together, muttering to himself. A woman with deep lines around her mouth clutched a plastic bag full of unpaid bills, her lips moving in silent prayers. The baby next to me fussed, and the mother bounced her gently while staring at the floor. I thought every one of us walked in with a different wound, but all the wounds smelled the same, of desperation and paper. I opened my folder again, though I already knew every word by heart, just to hold the papers tighter, afraid they might vanish if I let them out of sight. When my number was called, I stood too quickly and nearly stumbled. The young clerk barely looked at me as she led me to a small office at the end of the hall. Inside, the walls were yellowed with age, stacked with binders that leaned like tired soldiers. Behind the desk sat a man with graying hair and a navy tie, his glasses perched low on his nose. He gestured for me to sit, and my knees trembled as I lowered myself into the chair. I laid the stamped documents on the desk, smoothing them as if they were fragile cloth, and began to speak. My voice cracked at first, but as I explained how my daughter had pushed me out, how the door had closed against me, how I had signed papers I did not understand, the words grew steadier, as though by telling it aloud I was finally pulling the poison out of my chest. He listened without interruption, his pen tapping softly against the margin of the page. When I finished, he picked up the documents and read carefully, his eyes narrowing at certain lines. Finally, he tapped the bottom corner with the tip of his pen. "This clause here," he said slowly, "it protects you. You have the right to remain in that property, specifically in the back room, for the duration of your life. They cannot legally remove you, nor can they sell the property without acknowledging that right." My breath caught. For a moment the words didn't make sense, as if he were speaking a foreign language. I leaned forward, scanning the line he indicated, and there it was, the quiet sentence I had overlooked, the one that had been hidden among all the legal jargon. Reservation of habitation, back room, lifetime. I felt my chest tighten, a strange mix of relief and sorrow washing over me. Relief that I was not powerless, that I still had some claim to the space I had built with my hands. Sorrow because my daughter had known, and she had still treated me as if I were nothing. She hadn't told me about the clause, hadn't respected it, hadn't respected me. She had simply locked the door and declared me erased, hoping my ignorance would do the rest. The lawyer watched me carefully, his voice softer now. "They may still try to push you out," he said. "Families often think paper doesn't matter. But this paper matters. It is your shield. You are not without rights." The words landed heavily inside me, like stones dropped into deep water. I asked if I could go back immediately, if I could knock on the door and insist they let me into that room. He shook his head slowly. "Legally, yes. But practically, you may face resistance. My advice is not to go alone. If you decide to return, have someone witness it. A neighbor, a community worker, even the police if necessary. But above all, do not believe you are powerless. You are not." I thanked him, my voice hoarse, and gathered the documents back into their sleeve. As I stood, my hands shook, but not with weakness, with anger, with clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt something inside me stand upright again. He gave me a card with his name and number, told me to call if they tried to sell or change the story. I clutched it as though it were a lifeline. Outside, the city felt sharper, the sounds louder, the air more solid. I walked slowly down the street, stopping at a bench to reread the clause again and again. The words blurred through tears, but I repeated them under my breath like a prayer. I have the right. The law says I belong. They cannot erase me. People bustled past, cars honked, a street vendor shouted about fresh mangoes, and all I could think was that my daughter had looked me in the eye and lied. Knowing these words existed, knowing she could never truly erase me. That was the betrayal inside the betrayal. Not only had she replaced me with another woman, she had done it while pretending the law was on her side, when in truth, it had always been mine. I walked to the bakery, bought a small roll in coffee with the last of my coins, and stood on the sidewalk eating slowly. The taste was bitter in my mouth, but it anchored me. I watched people hurry to work, children skipping in uniforms, and for a moment I remembered my daughter at 7, her school bow crooked, her tiny shoes scuffed, clutching my hand tightly as I walked her to the gate. I remembered promising her she would never feel abandoned, that I would always fight for her. The irony cut deep. I had fought for her all my life, and now I would have to fight against her to claim what little was left for me. When I returned to the boarding house, I spread the papers on the bed as if laying out a map. The baby next door giggled, and the sound surprised me. It loosened something tight in my chest. I wrote a list on a scrap of paper. Go back to the lawyer. Ask about blocking a sale. Ask about returning with a witness. Ask about registering the clause more visibly. The verbs were strong. Ask, demand, insist. Words I had never allowed myself before. For years I had lived in the language of sacrifice. Give, endure, provide. Now I would have to learn the language of resistance. That night, sleep did not come easily. My mind replayed every moment of the past year, each one now illuminated by the truth I held in my hands. The request for my signature, the lies about insurance, the smiles that hid sharpness. The lock changed while I was away. They had counted on my silence, on my ignorance, on the love that had always made me say yes. But tomorrow, I would not be silent. Tomorrow I would return not as a ghost begging at the window, but as a woman holding proof that she could not be erased. I whispered the words of the clause one last time before closing my eyes, and for the first time since my clothes had landed on the sidewalk, I felt something close to strength pulse quietly in my chest. The dawn of the following day broke with a pale light that spilled through the cracked window of the boarding house, painting the damp walls with a gray so thin it seemed more shadow than brightness. I rose before the corridor stirred, before the baby next door began his first cries, before the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. My heart beat steadily, not calm, but not panicked either. Something between the two, like the drum roll before a verdict. I packed the documents carefully, folded my sweater around them to keep the papers dry, and slipped the lawyer's card into the pocket of my skirt. Today I would face them, not to beg, not to ask for love, but to show them that their plan was built on lies, and that I had not vanished from the story of the house as easily as they had imagined. The streets were still waking when I left. Vendors were dragging crates of fruit into place, their voices hoarse with sleep, while buses groaned against the morning traffic. I stopped at a kiosk and bought a single pencil for $1, slipping it into my bag as if even that small tool might help me mark a line through the fog of betrayal. As I walked, I rehearsed what I would say when I stood before her again. I pictured her eyes, perhaps defiant, perhaps avoiding mine, and I told myself I would not cry this time. Tears had bought me nothing but pity, and pity was a poor shield. I would hold the papers steady in my hands and let the black ink speak louder than my grief. When I turned the corner of the street where my house stood, my legs faltered. From a distance it looked unchanged. The tree leaning slightly, the paint on the gate chipped, the steps still worn by years of our footsteps. But as I drew closer, the familiar ache returned. Curtains drawn, silence heavy. A house that once smelled of garlic frying and laundry drying in the afternoon now looked like a stranger's home. I stood across the street, clutching my bag, watching for signs of life. And then the door opened. His mother stepped out with a bag of trash, her hair pinned neatly, her face serene as if she had always belonged there. She paused to lock the door, humming softly. My breath caught in my throat. She was living my mornings, replacing the rhythm of my hands with her own, carrying out the rituals that had once defined my existence. I wanted to march across the street right then, to confront her with the papers, to shout that she was a thief, a trespasser. But I forced myself to wait, to watch. Soon after, my daughter appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back, her hands busy adjusting the strap of her purse. She laughed at something the older woman said, the sound ringing out into the street like a melody that once belonged to me. I pressed myself against the wall of the building across from them, my heart hammering. That laugh had been mine once. I had pulled it from her with stories, with small gifts, with sacrifices she never saw, and now it was freely given to another. I stepped forward then, unable to hold back any longer. My shoes clicked against the pavement, and both women turned. My daughter's face froze, surprise flashing in her eyes before she quickly masked it with irritation. His mother's lips curled in a polite smile that barely concealed her triumph. "Mama," my daughter said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" I pulled the folder from my bag and held it up, the purple stamps catching the morning light. "I am here because this paper says I have the right to be," I answered, my voice trembling but loud enough to carry. I opened the pages and pointed to the clause, reading it aloud, each word deliberate, each syllable heavy. Reservation of habitation, back bedroom, for the duration of her life. That is me. That is my right. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to me. For a moment she faltered, her lips parting, the mask slipping. But then his mother stepped closer, her voice honeyed. "Oh dear, you misunderstand. That was just a formality, nothing serious. You don't really want to live here anymore, do you?" The casual cruelty of her tone cut through me, but I did not lower the papers. "I never gave up my place," I said firmly. "You can change the locks, you can tell stories to the neighbors, but you cannot erase the ink on this page. I belong in that house, in that room." My daughter shifted uncomfortably, her purse strap twisting in her fingers. For a fleeting second, I saw the little girl in her, the one who used to hide behind me when strangers spoke too loudly. But then she hardened, her chin lifting. "Mama, this is not about papers. It's about peace. You make everything harder. We just want a calm life. Please don't ruin that for us." Her words landed like stones thrown at my chest. "Peace," she called it. My silence had been their peace, my erasure, their calm. I wanted to scream that I had carried their chaos for years, that my hands had built their so-called peace. Instead, I simply held the papers higher. "Then let the law decide," I said quietly. "Because if you think you can sell this house without me, if you think you can push me into the street like trash, you are wrong. I will not disappear." Her mother-in-law's face darkened, her smile gone. My daughter's eyes filled with something I couldn't name: fear, anger, shame. She turned away, muttering something I couldn't hear, and closed the door without another word. I stood on the step for several minutes, my hands shaking, my chest heaving. I hadn't been let in, but I hadn't been erased either. For the first time, I had forced them to see me, not as a shadow, but as a wall they could not simply push through. When I finally walked away, the papers still clutched in my hands, I felt the tremor of both victory and grief. Victory because I had spoken, because I had stood, because I had not bowed. Grief because I knew the distance between us had widened into something unbridgeable. As I returned to the boarding house, I whispered to myself again and again, "I am not gone. I am not gone." The words felt raw, but they were mine, and I clung to them like a rope in the dark. That night, back in the narrow room of the boarding house, I sat with the papers spread across the bed, the lamp flickering above me, the hum of voices drifting through the thin walls. I had confronted them. I had spoken with a firmness I did not know still lived in my throat. Yet instead of triumph, what I felt was a strange quiet, heavy and unfamiliar. The truth was, I had not won anything concrete. The door was still closed, the bed was still occupied by another, the house still pulsed with laughter that no longer included me. But I had shifted something. I had broken the silence. They now knew I would not vanish without resistance. And that realization, both theirs and mine, was more powerful than any plea for love could ever be. I lay down and stared at the ceiling. The plaster cracked into shapes that resembled rivers on an old map. I thought about maps then, how I had always imagined my life leading only in one direction, toward my daughter, as if every sacrifice, every overtime shift, every bill paid, every coin counted was an arrow pointing toward her future. I had never drawn a line for myself, and now that she had cut me out, I realized I stood at the edge of a blank map. No path, no compass, no promises, only empty space waiting to be filled. The idea terrified me, but somewhere in the terror was also a strange flicker of freedom. The following morning, the boarding house stirred awake, the baby crying, doors slamming, footsteps hurrying down the corridor. I washed my face in the cracked sink and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at me no longer seemed like a ghost. Her eyes, though ringed with exhaustion, held a spark of defiance. Her lips, though pressed thin with pain, curved with the faintest trace of resolve. I whispered to her, "You are still here." And for the first time, I believed it. I walked through the city with the folder pressed against my chest, the lawyer's card tucked safely in my bag. I went to the clinic and asked again for shifts. The nurse gave me 3 days of work cleaning exam rooms, and I accepted gratefully. The money was small, but it was mine. Each coin earned with my own hands reminded me that I could still create something, no matter how modest. On my breaks, I sat in the courtyard with a thermos of coffee and the papers, reading the clause aloud under my breath, as if teaching myself a new language, the language of rights, of boundaries, of selfhood. Days blurred into weeks. I returned once more to the house, this time with a community worker by my side. We stood at the door, papers in hand, while my daughter glared from behind the frame. The worker explained calmly, professionally, that the clause was binding, that I had the right to the back room. My daughter's eyes flickered, her knuckles white against the door. She did not welcome me, but she did not deny the truth either. The battle was not over, but the silence was broken. I walked away that day not with keys, not with reconciliation, but with something almost more important: acknowledgement. She could no longer pretend I did not exist. At night, lying in the boarding house bed, I thought of forgiveness. Could I ever forgive her? Could I ever wash clean the image of my clothes on the sidewalk? The sound of her voice calling me a burden? The answer did not come. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps forgiveness was not the point. What mattered now was survival, dignity, carving a life from the ruins she had left behind. I realized I had spent decades believing that motherhood was my only identity, that being her mother was the reason for my breath, my labor, my sacrifices. But now I saw that even stripped of that title, I remained. A woman scarred, yes. A woman betrayed, yes. But also a woman still capable of standing, of demanding, of living. One evening, as the sun sank low and the city bathed in gold, I walked past the church where I had spent my first night after being thrown out. I stepped inside, sat in the last pew, and let the silence surround me. I thought of my mother, of the warnings she had whispered decades ago. Be careful who you sacrifice for, because some will build their throne on your broken back. I had not listened then. I had built the throne, and I had watched them climb it together while I was cast aside. But in that silence, I realized something else. I did not have to remain broken. My back had bent, yes, but it had not snapped. I was still here, and as long as I drew breath, I could rise. When I left the church, the streets buzzed with evening life, children chasing a ball, vendors calling out their last sales, the scent of frying onions drifting from open windows. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, as though teaching myself how to claim space again. The papers were heavy in my bag, but my spine felt lighter. For the first time since that night on the sidewalk, I no longer felt like a shadow. I was flesh, voice, will, and so I whisper it now, not as a plea, not as a prayer, but as a declaration. I am not gone. I am not erased. I am more than the sacrifices, more than the betrayals, more than the silence they tried to bury me under. My daughter may have chosen another family. My bed may be occupied by another woman. My home may never again feel like mine. But I remain. I endure. I live. And from the ruins of their betrayal, I will build something that belongs only to me.